Today, we will explore the historical barriers communities of color have faced when trying to vote, such as the grandfather clause or poll tax, etc., and the success of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We will also explore the impact of the 2013 U.S. Supreme Court decisions, such as Shelby County versus Holder and Allen versus Milligan. We hope that you take away from today's conversation the important role that communities of color have played throughout the years in activism and advocacy space when it comes to voting rights. And we also hope that you walk away with a better understanding of the voter protection initiatives that are afforded here in the state of New Jersey under the New Jersey Office of the Attorney General and the Division on Civil Rights. I won't bore you with any further opening remarks. And without further ado, I turn it over to today's moderator, Kai Durant.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kai Durant. I am a community relations specialist with the Division on Civil Rights, and I'm excited to moderate this discussion today. To start, I would like to welcome our panelists, Alejandra, Makari, James, and Tony to join us so we can start our conversation as we delve into voting rights, looking at the past, present, future, and ways that we can engage with our community members. To get started, I would ask that each panelist to introduce themselves, say your name, what organization you're with, and to share a fun fact. So either share why are you interested in voting rights work, or maybe talk about the first time you voted, what might have been the experience or feelings you had going in there. So I want to see if there's any volunteers who might want to go first, or I can randomly select someone.
I'll jump in.
Thanks.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with y'all discussing a topic that is very near and dear to my heart, which is voting rights. I'm Alejandra S, she, her, ella pronouns. I'm a campaign strategist with the ACLU of New Jersey. And to Kai's question, voting and my first time voting, I'm an immigrant, and I think voting is something that only recently came to me. I didn't grow up in a culture of voting as much, unfortunately, in my home country. And it's something that really I learned as an immigrant here through grassroots organizations that were doing tremendous organizing work on the ground. And I think voting, the way that I learned it and why it's so important to me is because it connects to so many issues that impact our communities. And I think that's where I see the biggest value is in connecting to the issues that day in and day out impact us and our families and our communities, and how voting is one tool to come together, to organize, and to push for a democracy that we want to see.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tony Hendricks, and I'm the second vice president for the New Brunswick area branch of the NAACP. I serve on several committees, but I think the most important committee relevant to today's discussion is I chair our community coordinator / civic engagement activities. We support 14 municipalities throughout central New Jersey. You'll hear more from us, from me specifically, regarding some of the work that the NAACP does related to the topic. In terms of my fun fact, when this came up during our practice run the other day, I was kind of taken aback because I never really looked at voting rights as a fun fact until a wonderful young lady named Kai said, well, there has to have been something notable that you could share with us. And at that time, I realized that I had been engaged in voting activities for 5 years before I was able to vote. The 26th Amendment to the United States lowered, in 1971, by the way, lowered the voting age to 18. I was already 19. So I've been in the journey a long time. So that was a fact to me, and I guess a fun fact. Thank you.
I can go next. Hi, everyone. So nice to be with all of you here today. My name is Miki Vargas. I'm an associate counsel at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. I work in the democracy program, so I primarily work on voting issues and some other democracy issues as well. Fun fact of when I first tried to vote is that I went to the wrong location, which is why, it would be great to have things like same-day registration. When I was very young, like Ale, I immigrated to this country when I was much younger, so I didn't feel that impact, but being a child of immigrant parents, voting was not something that I grew up with or like learned about. So naturally, when I first had the opportunity, I messed it up. And it's because of, partly my own lack of education, but also just overall, we have a decrease in civics education, I think, in a lot of our school systems. So that's part of the reason I'm passionate about this work. I think education about these issues is really important.
And I'm Jim Michael. I am Chief of Legal Affairs for the Division on Civil Rights. And I come to the current position. I've sort of represented the Division on Civil Rights for about 30 years within the Attorney General's office. I use he, him pronouns. And fun fact, I'll call it fun, but at least I remember when I was in high school, and this is more of sort of a more local election issue, that we had the same mayor in our town for as long as anybody can remember. He had been mayor for decades, and nobody ever thought that anybody else could be mayor until one of a friend of mine's mother decided to challenge him, which was sort of unheard of, that anybody would think to challenge the sitting mayor. So we got involved in the campaign, and it worked, and I think it was the first election that I voted in. It was a local election, and not the happiest ending. She lost, and the guy continued to be mayor for who knows how much longer. But the experience, I think, was worth it, with elections that you do your best. Sometimes you win, and unfortunately, sometimes you don't, but the fight is always worthwhile.
Thank you all for sharing your fun fact around voting. It's always interesting to hear other people's experience or like things that stuck out to them. Going into our next question, can each of you talk about the organization you're here representing, talk about what might be some of the voting rights programs or initiatives, and what are ways that people can engage with your program or initiative? I don't know if you want to start with Alejandra.
Sure. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm with the American Civil Liberties Union of New Jersey, and we're a nonpartisan civil rights organization here in the state of New Jersey. And democracy is one of our core areas of work, and not only protecting voter rights, but expanding and making voting easier and more accessible to everyone so they can exercise this fundamental right at every level. So there are a few campaigns that I'll throw it to Mikaudi for some of them. I'll mention one, and we work very closely with partners on all of these campaigns. So I don't want to talk about all of them. And so I'll mention one, which is the campaign to pass the New Jersey Voting Rights Act. So you'll hear from wonderful people like Tony talk about the Federal Voting Rights Act. But as we know, also the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965 has been gutted by the U.S. Supreme Court, and several provisions that made it the strong legislation that it was have been unfortunately removed. And to that end, we want to make sure that New Jersey has strong protections to the right to vote for all New Jerseyans. And to that end, we're hoping to pass New Jersey level Voting Rights Act. So that is one of our core campaigns that we're working closely with the Institute and a wide range of partners across the state to enact. And it's a legislation that would not only protect existing rights, but expand them and make sure that we're meeting the needs of all voters in New Jersey and that everyone can make their voice heard at the ballot box. And let me pass it to Mikaudi.
Thanks, Ale. Yeah, so I won't talk too much about the NJVRA, but that is one of the campaigns that we are working on at the Institute. And the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, for those who might not know us, we're a state org that uses racial and social justice advocacy tools to empower people of color, to try to rebuild systems and work to create wealth, transform justice, and of course harness the democratic power of New Jerseyans from the ground up. And we, like Ale mentioned, work in coalition a lot with other partners, some of which I think are on the webinar right now, actually. And we also focus on expanding and protecting access to the ballot, particularly for communities historically marginalized in the democratic process. Some of these initiatives, like Ali mentioned, are the NJVRA, which seeks to protect against voter suppression, disenfranchisement, same-day voter registration, which would allow voters to register on the day of election days and the days of early voting. And we're also working currently on expanding automatic voter registration to Medicaid applicants, and also trying to lower the voting age for local elections to 16 around the state. That initiative aims to engage younger generations in civic life, and it's a very exciting opportunity. And if you're interested in working on all of those things, I think someone will be dropping in the chat the Take Action page for our organization, where you can help us with some of the digital asks. We do like phone to action. Sometimes we'll do sign-on letters, and you'll get more information by signing up to our newsletter.
So the general mission of the Division on Civil Rights is to enforce the state's law against discrimination, which is to address bias-based discrimination and harassment in employment, housing, access to public accommodations. And that would include, public accommodations would include polling places. So the agency has the authority to prevent discrimination, the access to polling places and to vote. And it's an agency within the Attorney General's office. For a long, for decades, the Attorney General's office has been involved in sort of protecting the integrity of elections through representation of the various county boards of election, and providing counsel to those county boards of election. I think it was in 2022. There was a decision made that there needed to be an additional focus on voter protection. So there was a voter protection initiative started at that time. So even though the vast, there's a lot of deputy attorneys general in the AG's office that work representing the boards of election, it sort of carved out a group of people to focus purely on the voter protection side and enforcing the laws, either the law against discrimination or the New Jersey Civil Rights Act, to the extent it is affecting people's ability to vote. So we do have people in the office on early voting who are scheduled, particularly just to this task for voter protection on early voting days and on election day, to address issues that come up for voters.
So, as I said earlier, I am a member of the NAACP. My branch is the New Brunswick area branch. The NAACP is the oldest, longest, boldest, biggest civil rights organization in the United States. We were founded in 1909, and interestingly enough, the founding of our organization was very much steeped in who we are as an organization. The founding of the organization was in direct response to trying to pass an anti-lynching law in the United States. So who we are as an organization is very much steeped in law and policy making. We recognize that civil rights touches every aspect of our life, and we have initiatives that are directly aligned with those in relationship to establishing policy and laws that are aligned with our views. We are also a nonpartisan organization, but we are extremely political. Like my branch president, who I think is on this call, he puts it down. He says we may be nonpartisan, but we are extremely politically active. And what that means is that our DNA runs through all areas of the civil rights that we have, whether it's housing, healthcare, education, the environment, but we look at it through the lens of racial equity and racial justice. So we focus on those policies that will drive the equity in racial life here in the United States. And as a result, we recognize that voting and the right to vote is the primary tool for all of us, every person eligible to vote, to have a say in the policies and the laws that affect every aspect of our life. So when Makari was speaking, we are very proud to partner with folks in the New Jersey Institute of Social Justice and others in very specific initiatives, which will come forward more in the presentation today. Thank you. And I was told my mic was low. Is it any better now? I have a little bit of a sore throat, so I just needed to get closer to the mic. Is it better now?
Mm-hmm.
Very good. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. I'll stay close to the microphone.
Thank you all. As we start our conversation about voting rights, we have to look at the past, look at what has previously been barriers to voting rights, what was going on there. So kind of start, Tony, can you talk about how have historical events and legislations shaped voting rights in the US, looking at the Voting Rights Act of 1965? Why was that needed?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think without, spending a lot of time on it, I think we need a small snapshot of the history of our country to understand why the Voting Rights Act was so important. And we have to go all the way back to the founding of this nation and the establishment of the Constitution. In 1787, when those individuals were struggling with developing a constitution for our newly formed government, they really didn't have a model. If you think about the world at that time, there were monarchies and dictatorships. There were no countries that were focused on voting rights and giving the common individual the right and the say in establishing their country. So it left it up to the individuals who were in charge at that point. And we all know that in charge means you get to write the rules. And the individuals who were in charge at that point were primarily interested in protecting their own rights. And we also have to remember that the original Constitution, it was left to the states to actually implement laws that were passed at the federal level, which gave the states a lot of leeway. And because the Constitution was founded during the time of the compromise on slavery, that had a lot to do with the barriers that were placed in front of people that the folks in charge just didn't want to see having the right to vote and to determine the outcome and the future of the country. So we have to go back that far to say, well, how did, why did this get established? And as I mentioned, when there's a vacuum and you're trying to create something, if there's no model there, you create it based upon what you want that model to be. So that model said, we want white Anglo-Saxon men who were in charge at that time, and most of them were also put under the category of landholders, to be the people who are entitled to vote and entitled to frame this country. And that law was very much followed by the different states according to how they wanted their state to be run. So we had the limitation of voting rights to a very small group of individuals, but a very powerful group of individuals. So it's just history, folks. It's not crying in our soup or trying to make any type of political statement. It's just saying that's the reality of the situation. So when we had the Civil War come along, and immediately followed the Civil War was the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which said, okay, Black men can vote. Again, there was a deliberate choice of words within that amendment that excluded individuals from the right to vote. And I think many of us on this panel know what that meant. It was women were excluded from the right to vote. And during Reconstruction, Black men were actually seated in Congress, but that didn't last very long because there were all kinds of local laws that were put into place that enabled the states to interpret who was eligible to vote. And many of those took on the form of literacy tests. Now, remember the time period we're talking about. Blacks weren't entitled to go to school. So literacy tests were a good way of keeping them from participating in a vote. However, you will say, well, yeah, well, there were white people that didn't go to school also. Yeah, but they were grandfathered in because their fathers had the right to vote. Poll tax. Poll tax is just another word for you have to pay to play. And in the state of New Jersey, we know what that means and all the efforts to try to eliminate pay to play. So these were all the different, and there were many other different ways of the states being able to manipulate the right to vote, which is why the Federal Act in 1965 that put safeguards in that said, listen, if you are a traditional state that employs tactics to deliberately keeping Black people from voting, you can't change your voting laws unless it's approved by the federal government. Remember that this was not the case before then. States were allowed to do what they wanted to do. And then the federal government named those states. And for a period of time, those states could not make a change in their voting laws without being approved by the federal government. And we saw improvements to the process taking place. And I'm sure Makari is going to help us understand what happened. I think it was 2013, right, Macaulay, that disrupted that. So, you know, that's a brief history. And by the way, we can think about the fact that there was a period of time when Asians couldn't vote. There was a period of time when indigenous people couldn't vote, when Chinese people couldn't vote. I mean, in our country, the right to vote has been grudgingly given to people of so-called minority status. So I'll end it there because I don't want to take up too much of the panel's time.
Thank you, Tony, for that brief history. Moving a little bit forward in history, Makari, there's been several Supreme Court decisions that has changed voting rights and protections. Can you talk about them and how that had impacted voting rights?
Yeah, so, you know, as Tony mentioned in the history of the passage of the Voting Rights Act, and, you know, what led to it was a lot of work and blood, sweat, and tears, you know, to create protections for, you know, particularly people of color. And what happened was, you know, the act then was able to enforce the 15th Amendment, granting Black men the right to vote. That, you know, there's also another complicated history with women's suffrage, and then also when we lowered the voting age to 20 from the 26th Amendment to 18. But, you know, more recently, the Supreme Court in 2013 essentially gutted very important parts of the federal VRA that enabled them to, you know, it struck down what was called the pre-clearance provision. This provision required jurisdictions with histories of racial discrimination to obtain federal approval before implementing changes to their voting laws. Without this safeguard, many states and localities started to introduce measures that disproportionately affect minority voters, such as stricter laws, reductions in early voting periods, and the closure of polling places in predominantly minority neighborhoods. Because now they don't have to go through that pre-clearance they would have to go through the Department of Justice, and they would then decide whether or not this was okay for them to do, right? The Allen v. Milligan case that was decided more recently in 2023, it basically further highlights the complexities and challenges associated with ensuring fair voting practices. This case involved allegations of racial gerrymandering, and that in and of itself could be a whole discussion on gerrymandering. But basically, it's where legislative district boundaries are drawn in a way that diluted the electoral power of racial minorities. Specifically, the plaintiffs argued that the district maps violated the Voting Rights Act by minimizing the influence of Black voters in Alabama. In Shelby County, sorry, not Shelby, that's the other case. The Supreme Court's decision in this case upheld the district court's decision, ruling that Alabama must create a second majority Black congressional district in compliance with what is Section 2 of the Voting Rights, which is really the only thing that's kind of left, and it's not in great shape either at this point, which is why we need a State Voting Rights Act, as Ale will probably talk more about later. This decision reaffirmed the need to scrutinize redistricting practices to prevent racial discrimination and ensure that minority communities have a fair opportunity to elect candidates of their choice. So together, these cases underscore the critical importance of both maintaining robust legal protections against discriminatory voting practices and ensuring that redistricting processes are transparent and equitable. The decisions also highlight the ongoing need for vigilance and proactive measures to protect voting rights, particularly for historically marginalized groups.
Thank you. As we talked a little bit about the past and change in voting rights, we're kind of transitioned into present day and look at what are the state of voting rights today. So to start, Alejandra, can you talk about what are the current voting options in New Jersey?
Sure, happy to talk about that. And I think before that, just to add a little bit to Tony and Mikaudi's point, the Federal Voting Rights Act was such an impactful piece of legislation. I think one example that constantly comes to mind is that in Mississippi, Black voter registration was 7% before the Federal Voting Rights Act, and it rose to 60%. So that shows that the huge impact that it had and why it was such a meaningful piece of legislation. And I think connecting the past to the present, while in the Jim Crow era, there were many barriers to voting, including poll taxes and literacy tests and grandfather clauses, I think it's hard to not bring it back to current voter suppression tactics that are very much in line with what we saw in the past, like citizenship proof and voter ID laws and preventing people from even giving food or water when they're standing in line at the polls, things like that, that really show how voter suppression tactics are at the rise and constantly trying to undermine the voices, particularly of people of color and Black voters. So just to add a little bit to that, to those points, but to talk a little bit about New Jersey. New Jersey, thankfully, in the face of many voter suppression tactics that we're seeing across the country, has taken important steps to protect and expand the right to vote. And to that end, we have 3 ways of voting in New Jersey that allow for different ways where people can exercise their fundamental right and make it easier to vote. There's a long way to go. There's many more things we can do, but in the meantime, we can speak to the progress that has been made and the legislation and actions that have been taken to make voting more accessible and easier to New Jersey voters. So the first one is vote by mail. So vote by mail, with a law that passed in 2019, if someone requests a vote by mail ballot, they will receive it every year. So that's one very convenient way to vote for folks. And we can put a link in the chat on what the process is, but you fill out an application to get a vote by mail ballot, you receive it in the mail, you fill it out, and you send it back either to your county clerk or drop it at a ballot drop box in your closest location. So that's one convenient way to vote. The other is early voting. That's my personal favorite. I'm an early voting girly. And for New Jersey, this was a huge step in increasing access to the ballot box. So early voting allows for several days before election for early voting locations to be open and for people to be able to go at a time that is most convenient to them. So for early voting, for primary elections, it's 5 days before election day that there will be early voting. And for the general election, it's 9 days before election day. So you can find your early voting location at the Secretary of State website or in the link that will be placed in the chat. And for this year's general election, the early voting period will be October 26th to November 3rd. So this another convenient way for people to be able to exercise the right to vote. I think for why it's a favorite for me is because for many people, I think voting on election day, on a Tuesday, on a weekday, it might be difficult. So early voting really expanded the way in which people can exercise their right and go at a time that's more convenient to them, on a weekend if it's easier, on an evening, etc. So I love early voting, as you can tell. And then in-person election day. So on election day, which is a Tuesday, the first Tuesday in November, for the general election, polls are open 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. in New Jersey, and you can find your polling location, which should be easily and convenient to you. And the most important thing when voting in person is to know your rights when you're voting in person. So we're going to place a link in the chat too for folks to know their rights when going to their polling location. So those are the 3 ways that New Jersey has expanded, and the 3 ways where on how people can vote.
Thank you. And as you talked about the 3 ways that people can vote, you also highlighted some of the advancements and improvements that voting rights have been made in New Jersey. I want to see if we can talk about any other advancements in the last decade in New Jersey when it comes to voting rights and improvement. I'll start with Jim, if you want to add.
Sure. And the one thing I think there's been a fair amount of legislation and things that the state has done over the last decade to improve the voting process, both in being able to vote and even vote counting and things like that. I did want to just focus on a few things that focused on access that have happened over the last few years. The first was restoring voting rights for people who are on probation or parole. It was effective, I think, in March of 2020 to make sure that it used to be the people involved in the criminal justice system were just disenfranchised from voting. So since March of 2020, people who are on probation or parole are eligible to vote. And it is only people who are currently serving a sense of incarceration who may not vote. But otherwise, people on probation or parole now, it's very clear, are eligible to vote. One other piece is the sort of the automatic voter registration to sort of improve that process. So unless someone opts out, if you go to the Motor Vehicle Commission, anytime you have interaction with MVC, if you're an eligible voter, you can automatically register to vote or update your information at motor vehicles. And there's been some efforts. I think Lafari had mentioned some of this about improving that with other agencies. But right now, with motor vehicles, any interaction with motor vehicles allows a voter to register or update their information. And some other discussion we had about the young people. So the new Voter Empowerment Act, it's not in effect yet, although it is passed, but it will become effective on January 1st, 2026, which will allow a 17-year-old to vote in a primary, provided that they would be eligible to vote they'll be 18 and eligible to vote in the general election. So just to make sure that if you're able to vote in if you're able to vote in the general election, you should have some say in who's going to be running in that election that you'll be able to vote on. So come 2026, 17-year-olds will be able to vote in the primary if they'll be 18 by the time of the general election.
I just have I think a few more other great advancements we've had. We've also banned police presence at polling places to prevent voter intimidation, which is extremely helpful for those individuals who just got their right to vote, who are on parole and probation. Any contact they have with law enforcement needs to be reported, so it does help them feel less intimidated going to these polling locations. And I may have missed it, but I think we also, we got online voter registration, which makes the registration process a lot easier. And also the ballot cure procedure, which allows voters to correct errors in their mail-in ballots, so to make sure that their votes are counted. These measures make voting more accessible and have helped to modernize the state's election infrastructure.
Thank you. Kind of moving on to our next question. Jim, you talked about a little bit about protections like when it came to voting under the LAD. Can you talk about like what are the voter protections afforded in New Jersey?
Sure. And again, and focusing on what the Division on Civil Rights and the Attorney General's office can do is that under the law against discrimination, we can ensure that people have access to polling places and the right to register and to vote without discrimination based on race, creed, color, national origin, disability, all of the sexual orientation, gender identity. All of those are protected under the law against discrimination. So anyone who believes they've been denied sort of access to be able to register or to vote because of a bias-based reason, can come forward and bring a complaint to the Division on Civil Rights. The one area where we have focused on under the law against discrimination is disability access. It doesn't, having the ability, to vote doesn't really help if you can't actually physically get in and vote. So we want to make sure that polling places, are accessible to people with disabilities who want to be able to go in and vote. And we've gone out and we've surveyed. I remember this is years ago, but at one point when we were looking at polling places, one of the polling sites was on the second floor of a building with no elevator. So I don't think we have those issues, hopefully, anymore. But if anybody encounters those, please let us know. But we want to make sure that there is that these polling places are accessible and that people with disabilities are entitled to vote, in an integrated setting, similar to the general public. So we want to make sure we're looking out for those. And those are, again, under the law against discrimination, that's bias-based. But separate from that, the Attorney General's office, also enforces the New Jersey Civil Rights Act. And under the Civil Rights Act, the Attorney General can bring an action against any person or entity who is denying someone's constitutional rights, whether it's protected under federal or state law. So, and one of those things clearly is the right to vote. So to the extent that someone is being, sort of denied the right to vote, it could be a violation of the State Civil Rights Act. And there's sort of two pieces of it. One, it's a violation of the Civil Rights Act to deprive someone of their constitutional rights. Or to interfere with them, with someone's exercise and enjoyment of those rights. The one thing with interference, the law does require the interference has to be by threats, intimidation, or coercion. So we would look at sort of both those. If somebody is, and it would generally, someone who's being deprived of their rights would be sort of, by the person who has the right to sort of give that ability to vote. But the interference would apply to anybody. So even if somebody, is trying to vote and there's somebody, outside threatening and intimidating them to prevent them from exercising their constitutional right, that would be a violation of the New Jersey Civil Rights Act. One other piece that's really important here from the Attorney General's perspective is that if under the Civil Rights Act, if the Attorney General is bringing the action, it's a violation whether or not it is occurring under color of law. So traditionally in a civil rights action, you would say, oh, it's got to be the government or somebody acting under color of law to do this. But that's not a requirement under the New Jersey Civil Rights Act when the AG is bringing the case. So even if it's a private person, a private entity who's engaging in this type of interference, then we would have jurisdiction to do something about that. And as I had mentioned, we have a designated staff members who are sort of scheduled and identified, who are just going to handle the voter protection side of the office. So when these issues come in, the resources are there to sort of investigate and handle these types of cases.
And then following up on that, how can someone report bias or discrimination?
Sure, I think I want to make sure that I get it right. So I have it written here. So, well, the one thing we work with a lot of community groups and community agencies, and there are sort of liaisons set up. So if you're working within a group or you're a member of one of these organizations, you may already have some contact people within the office that you can sort of follow up with. Otherwise, there is a state voter information and assistance line at 1-877-NJ-VOTER. I'll repeat that again, 1-877-NJ-VOTER. And someone can report issues there if they've been adversely affected in trying to register or vote. And those would get sort of steered over to the voter protection initiative. If they are law against discrimination issues, like bias-based issues of harassment or discrimination, whether it's disability or any other protected category, you can also reach out to the Division on Civil Rights, and I can give that number. It's 1-800-277-BIAS, BIAS, 1-800-277-BIAS. Or you can anyone can go on the Division on Civil Rights website, njcivilrights.gov, and there's also information there, as well as the ability to go and put information in to make a complaint through the NJ Civil Rights Bias system, and someone will sort of get back to you and follow up on what you put in the system.
So thank you. So pivoting the question a little bit, can we look at what are the significant challenges to voting in New Jersey today, and how does it impact different communities? I'm going to start with Alejandra.
Sure, I can mention a few, but open to the other panels, of course, chiming in with additional ones. I think first and foremost, voter registration rates are incredibly low, unfortunately, in New Jersey. And one way to increase these efforts is to enact legislation that will make it easier to register to vote. So we're talking automatic voter registration, which happens at locations like MVC, but expanding it to other government agencies and where any person could interact and be registered to vote. So making easy and convenient for someone to register to vote when they're interacting with any government entity. Same day voter registration, as Miki already mentioned as well. Someone should not be denied the right to vote because they missed an arbitrary deadline of 21 days. So registering young people before they turn 18 could be another way of increasing voter registration. Public education is a key one too. Multilingual public education. We're one of the most diverse states in the country. And for many communities, this is not something that I think I mentioned my background as an immigrant. No one tells you where you can register to vote, how you can register to vote, what the process is. And that is the case for many immigrant communities or people who are newly naturalized. So public education in several languages could be a key way to increase access to voter registration, because the lack of information can be the line between someone exercising their right to vote and not. So one key way of that, and supporting organizations like the NAACP, like many other organizations that are doing civic engagement work on the ground. So increasing investment in civic engagement efforts across the board and meeting communities where they are and providing them with the resources that they need to register, to know how to vote, to know their rights when voting, and what they can do if their rights are violated. And to that point, also language access. As I mentioned, New Jersey is one of the most diverse states, and increasing language access at the polls when someone wants to exercise their right to vote is another key way to increase access to voting. And that's one way where the New Jersey Voting Rights Act that we're hoping to enact would address the needs of a multilingual state like New Jersey, because while the Federal Voting Rights Act has some language provisions, a state level Voting Rights Act would really be tailored to the needs of our state and would increase access to language resources, depending on what each county looks like and meeting the needs of communities there. I think a few just other barriers that I'm going to mention is insufficient poll worker training that sometimes leads to illegal demand for voter ID at the polls. And one point that I will bring up is that the Attorney General represents the County Board of Elections, and which can create a conflict and hinders the Attorney General's ability to enforce civil rights laws. So that is a conflict that we see and a barrier that we see as well. So I'm going to stop there.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in on this from two perspectives, both in the work that I do with the NAACP, and also I have been a poll worker for many, many, many years. So I want to bring into the perspective, particularly regarding what Alejandro talked about, that we are fighting for regarding same-day voter registration and misinformation that is being put forward by individuals who don't want it, that it would be costly, it'd be cumbersome, it's yet another thing that the government has to worry about and pay for. Well, that is definitely misinformation. If you've ever been involved in provisional voting at a voting location, you know that the form is the voter registration form that you're asked to fill out before you issue your ballot. So it is a very simple process. It's being done all the time at voting locations, where if an individual should not be turned away because we can't find them in the poll books or something of that nature, so we give them the right to vote provisionally. That simply means you will cast your vote, but it has to be verified that you are allowed to vote, that you meet all the requirements of voting. So your vote may not be counted that day, but it'll be counted in the final results. So I wanted to bring that forward. I also wanted to bring up the fact about accessibility and the last minute movement of polling locations without providing adequate or sometimes any information to the public about the move that has been made where their voting location has changed. This is happening every day in some areas, more so than others. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist, so I won't dare to say, but I'll say maybe there's a reason for that in terms of voter suppression. So we need to do a better job in that. And when it comes to a person understanding the rules around where you should vote, I believe that there needs to be, I'm going to leave it up to those with legal minds and that can, noodle through this better than I can. But when people move or change their address or their name, they're not understanding that affects their voter registration process. And that seems to me, if we can figure out how to get, the motor vehicle department to come on board, we need to get the post office or whoever that's doing these changes from locations that a person understands your voter registration ends at your old location. And it is against the law for us to send you to that old location to vote, because you should only be voting where you are supposed to be registered to vote. So those are some additional areas I'd like to see that are currently affecting our ability to vote.
I just wanted to just briefly address the question about if there may be a conflict within the Attorney General's office. And I think there a recognition of that, because as I said before, for decades, the Attorney General's office has been representing the boards of election, and still does in all these matters. So I think recognizing that there have been sort of protocols put in place with the Voter Protection Initiative, and there's walls within the office of you're on one side or the other. So the people on the vote who are designated voter protection side are sort of separate from the people who are representing the boards of election. And so we can't sort of deal with sort of all of it, but there are some efforts to sort of address those so that people on the voter protection side are not necessarily sort of addressed they're different on at least the ethical walls that we've put up on the between the other side of the office.
I'm going to move ahead for the sake of time. So I'm skipping a couple of questions, but while we're still talking about the state of voting rights today, I know a lot of you have mentioned throughout the program some different legislations that are out there that's supposed to help increase access to voting and voting rights. Can you just go over very briefly what are current legislations we should pay attention to in voting rights if we want to keep our eye on it?
You want to go first, Ale?
I'll start and then I'll pass it to you. I'll mention the constant drumbeat of the New Jersey Voting Rights Act. I'll mention that and then I'll pass it to you, Miki, for all and Tony for all the other efforts. But I think I can't emphasize enough the impact that a New Jersey level Voting Rights Act would have. It would establish its own pre-clearance program, which at the beginning, Miki mentioned that it has been gutted from the Federal Voting Rights Act. So what a pre-clearance program would do is prevent voter discrimination or any practices that could dilute or impact voters when trying to exercise their right to vote. So incredibly important provision of this legislation. I think it was put in the chat. If not, it will be sent to attendees after, but it's S3009 A4083. That is the New Jersey Voting Rights Act that we're hoping to pass soon in New Jersey. And it's a robust piece of legislation that would not only protect, but truly expand access to the ballot box and enact strong protections against discrimination, coercion, or intimidation at the polls. It would expand language access to meet the needs of our state. It would establish a pre-clearance process. It would expand data accessibility, so ensuring that New Jersey has a central data hub where we can go to see what the numbers of voters are looking like and address any needs that might happen. So it's a long bill, but if we have some snippets on our website, we have ways to take action. And it's a piece of legislation that, especially at a time where we're seeing so many voter suppression tactics across the country, New Jersey can and should be a leader in establishing its own Voting Rights Act. Passing to Miki.
Thanks, Ale. Sorry, I promise, Kai, I'll go to the actual question, but they've already done such a wonderful job talking about the bills. I was curious, Jim, that you made that comment about the deputy, that they're walled off, because I was something, obviously I wasn't always aware of it, but election duty when I was a deputy with the agency was not fun to take people's voting rights away. So I'm glad that there are other mechanisms that the AG is looking to ensure that there is, the ability to do that and not be, biased in any way. But to the actual question about legislation, obviously the NJVRA, which Ale did a wonderful job explaining, but then also Tony mentioned a lot of the actual ways of same-day voter registration. I did provide the bill numbers with links for you all who are in attendance. If you look, I think it came around 1227, there are links to the same-day voter registration bill. That's A925 on the Assembly side and S1193 on the Senate side. And you can look at the language. They should match, but I just gave them all for you to look at. And then same thing with the expansion of automatic voter registration. Obviously, with same day, that initiative would allow citizens to register and vote on the same day and days of early voting by eliminating the need for pre-registration, allowing for immediate participation. It would address those issues that Tony mentioned, right? Like if you're moving from one location to the other, which tends to happen more often with younger voters and, of course, communities of color because of so many reasons, but a lot of them doing with like the socioeconomic standing of these people at any given moment makes them more transient. Also, it impacts people who just became new citizens and might not be, maybe hypothetically won't become citizens and able to register to vote by that deadline because of whatever logistical administrative reason, but then would be able to do it on the day of election day. Same thing with people who are in the military abroad. This helps them when they come back, and they might be moving to a different location that would need them to register in that new area. With the expansion of automatic voter registration, while we do already have automatic voter registration and it's great in its current form, we would like an expansion of that to cover more government agencies. Of course, ensuring that all these agencies keep in mind certain protections for those who are non-citizens. And it would be implemented in New Jersey, and it would be to support and enhance and maximize the impact on voter participation. And then the last bill I included for fun because it's my passion project at the Institute is the lowering the voting age to 16 for school board elections. That bill number is also on the link we sent out. And on the Assembly side, it's A4369, and on the Senate side, S3240. Currently, we're doing a more local approach to that, where we have working with towns and cities to lower the age by ordinance. But we do have a state legislation that would automatically lower it across the board in New Jersey. And the thinking behind that is that, well, any age could be arbitrary, arguably, but it is a good juncture. It is the age of compulsory education is no longer required at that age. They're with their peers. They'd be voting for issues that are directly impacting them and creating that lifelong habit of voting that is so important to develop and at earlier ages now more than ever, but also encouraging more civics education in our public school systems and other school systems, of course. But those are the things that, the legislative initiatives that are critical to us at the Institute and people should keep an eye on to, protect and expect voter participation in our democracy.
Thank you. Keeping cautious of time, we're going to quickly do our last section, which is looking at how can you be more involved in community when it comes to voting rights, engaging with community members. So I want to go to Tony. Can you talk about what are maybe strategies that you might have utilized or other people can utilize when they're in communities, if they're trying to interest people in voting and people who might be disinterested? Like, what are some strategies or talking points that might be helpful that you might have used or to engage community?
Absolutely. I'm going to only focus on a couple of things because I do understand time is of the essence. But my passion regarding this is engaging younger people. I won't just call them youth. I'll call them younger people because, as I've mentioned and as history has taught us, the vote, things change, and the vote is the way for things to change. And what has happened over time, however, is that the education process for younger people regarding civics and regarding the meaning of voting and how it impacts on our daily lives, not just every 4 years on the presidential election, on our daily lives on a routine basis, I think is key. And, we organize ourselves into a committee structure that's focused on the different aspects of our civil rights, whether it's environmental justice, whether it's healthcare, whether, education, it doesn't matter. If it's part of your daily life, we focus on that. And we always tie in the pathway to change is through the ballot box, through voting for those things that will make a difference and to change the policies that affect you. So we do an awful lot of education in those areas, and we're heavily invested in our youth. At the national level, we have a next gen program, which is specifically designed. There's some brilliant young women on this call right now, and they would be part of that program to continue their involvement and their growth to become the future leaders at a national level in civil rights organizations. And we do it on a local level through our engagement with the universities and even through the high schools, and engaging our children, our youth, and not just talking to them. We make them members of our board. There are young people at the board level nationally right down to our branch level, which we are very proud of. So my focus is in those areas, and there are others, but that's what I'd like to bring to the table today. Thank you.
Thank you. And then my next question for the group quickly, voting is one part of being active civically or in your communities and engage. Past election day, how else can people be engaged? So like you voted, what's next? How else can you be engaged besides waiting for a next election?
Yeah, so I want to jump in on this real quick and then I'll shut up. Okay. But Makawi mentioned the vote 16. All right. So engagement is our young people are becoming members of boards of education. Did I say that boards of education throughout this state? We are very proud of that. And that's a way of teaching our young people and even old farts like myself to become involved in the process, become political. Join your councils, join your planning boards. That's a good way of staying engaged. And for parents, bring your children to the polls. Show them what it means to vote. Encourage their rights. Give them exposure to how different rules and policies affect their day-to-day lives. And if you're not a parent, if you're just a senior citizen like myself, be out there pounding the streets, talking to young people, talking to others and saying, did you know this? And you know what you're going to find out? They didn't know it. So an educated electorate is what we're hoping for. And I promised I'd shut up, and I am now.
I think I'll just add to Tony's point. Voting is just one piece of civic engagement. And while it's a fundamental and important piece, civic engagement can look so many different ways. It can look like volunteering at a local organization. It can look like testifying on a bill that you care about. It can look like attending a rally, talking to your family members. My family knows I am the annoying person on Thanksgiving and Christmas talking about civic engagement, but have registered my 90 plus cousins and talk about voter registration. So really having conversations, I think people that you trust and people that you care about will listen to you and what you care about, and connecting to the issues that matter to them. It is one way to begin having the civic engagement conversation. Holding elected officials accountable, voting is one thing, and then civic engagement is a year-round action. It's a year-round process. It's holding the people in power accountable at every step of the way, and really just think of any issue that you care about, and most likely than not, there will be other people or organizations doing work in that area. So plug in. Really, like any and every action is important when it comes to collectively pushing for a truly representative democracy.
Thank you all. I want to leave the last few minutes for questions. So we have a few questions in the Q&A tab. We might not be able to get through all of them, but we will do our best. The first question is asked if this will be a recording be available. This will be recorded and will be shared shortly with others. The next question is, how far away must law enforcement be from the polling place?
I'll jump in. So there was a law passed in 2022 that establishes that police can be 100 feet or further away from a polling location. I will flag that unfortunately there are some attempts to roll back that law that passed, and I think we are in opposition of that rollback because, as we know, police relationships with different communities can look very different. And for voters, particularly voters of color, it can be an intimidating factor when it comes to exercising their right to vote. So there is the law that has passed right now bars police from being closer than 100 feet from a polling location.
Thank you. The next question, I think this is for Jim. Someone asks, when is it appropriate to contact the Division of Civil Rights if you feel you have been violated? Are there initial steps that a community member should follow by contacting their local prosecutor's office?
Yeah, so the one thing to know, the Division on Civil Rights is a a civil enforcement agency. So we don't prosecute crime. So if what has happened to you is a crime, you should call your local police or the county prosecutor's office. If you so what we are looking to do is both make changes, equitable changes, or changes that and practices that people will do, and get people and people can collect damages, like for being denied their rights or discriminated against. So yeah, so once you have, if you have been if you feel you've been discriminated against, then you should contact DCR through there. And the process works is that if you go online and put your information in, they'll set up an interview. You'll get a notice that someone will set up a phone interview with you and get more information. Now, if you want to file a complaint with DCR, the statute does require that it be filed within 180 days of the act of discrimination. So that's just one thing to keep in mind, that if you want to come to the Division on Civil Rights, and file a complaint, it would need to be within 180 days. You have the option to go directly into court and not come to DCR at all under the law against discrimination, and you would have 2 years to do that. But it's always better to come, sooner than later, and sort of let us know it. But the statute of limitations for filing with DCR is 180 days.
Kai, can I plug quickly? There's also an election protection hotline in New Jersey that several partners, including the Institute and others on the call, work on during election time. And I'm going to put the Know Your Rights in the chat, where you can find the phone number where you can call if you're at the poll, if you're planning to go to the polls, or if you think your rights are being violated, or honestly, if you have any questions. I think that hotline can help for many different things. So I'm just going to plug it in the chat for folks.
Thanks. It's another question we have. Someone said, like, this was an amazing panel. Could you talk or elaborate about, there's 3 points they have: the language access protection in voting, ballot current, and the prohibition on electioneering in or near polling places.
As a poll worker, I can address the last point. I'll leave it to the legal folks to address the other two. We have signage that is provided at every polling location that we are instructed to put on prominent display outside of the building, and even at the inside on the walls, that does, address what electioneering is, the wearing of certain paraphernalia and whatnot. And I can tell you personally that we do enforce that. I have done so personally. So we do look for those violations, and you just have to be tactful and indicate to people and show them that that is a requirement. And hopefully it goes well. If not, sometimes we have to resort to calling for help, but it is practiced at the polling locations. So if you see it not being practiced, you should raise up that alarm.
Yeah, and I will say this, until I started doing election work, I didn't realize it, but sometimes outside at least outside, my polling place, there'll be like a flag or something, there'll be some marker in the ground. And what I never realized until I did that is that somebody has measured 100 feet.
Correct.
And sort of put markers there to sort of, so it may not necessarily say, okay, this is the, sort of electioneering area, but there should be at least some demarcation from the polling place of 100 feet of where electioneering is prohibited inside that space.
I can speak to language access, Kai. I might send it to Mikaudi for the hearing piece. But language access, so New Jersey falls right now under the provisions of the Federal Voting Rights Act, which determines that if a population is 2% or more of a different language need, the polling location has to provide that resources and a ballot in that language. For example, if in certain counties there's 2% or more population that speaks Spanish or other language, they need to provide the resources in that language. Where we are hoping to expand language accessibility is by increasing, it's 5% right now with the Federal Voting Rights Act. We want to decrease that to 2% with the New Jersey Voting Rights Act because of the diversity of our state. So there are localities where it might be 3-4% of the population that speaks Korean or Chinese or any other language. And we want to make sure that if it's a significant portion of the population, that they're being provided resources and ballot and information in that language so that they can fully exercise their right. But right now, the protections that exist fall under the Federal Voting Rights Act.
Yeah, so for the ballot cure procedures, so I can't recall right now when this passed, but it was probably a few years ago. There were a lot of election or voting protection laws passed in like 2019, 2020 time. But basically, you as a voter will vote in either in person or vote by mail. You will receive a letter from your county board of elections in the coming, like a few weeks after you've sent in your ballot in whatever form. And if there are basically, if your signature doesn't match, or like signature deficiencies in your vote by mail ballot, for instance, then you'll receive a cure letter from your board of elections, and then you'll have the opportunity to update your signature in order to vote in order for your vote to be counted in that election. You do have to be really careful about there's the letter, you'll have instructions on how to complete it and fill it out and return that form. It will be self-addressed, and the postage is prepaid. The envelope has prepaid postage for that mailing. But there are other, there is a deadline, and it does change by election. So typically it's about 2 weeks or something like that. I can look for the exact date for this upcoming general election and put it in the chat for you all.
Thank you all. It is time, so I won't hold everyone longer, but I want to say a big thank you to Jim, Tony, Alejandra, and Mikari. Thank you guys for taking your time out to engage in this conversation and participate in this panel. Voting rights is such an important topic each and every year, so I'm glad that the audience members were able to hear from experts and see what are people doing in the field, what are new laws that they should follow, what are your current rights in New Jersey, and hopefully everyone will take this information and share it with your network, share it with others, so that everyone is informed about what their rights are and how they can engage, and also engage with the different organizations here: Division on Civil Rights, NAACP, ACLU New Jersey, New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. These are all great organizations to get involved with, to engage in voting rights, civic engagement, and other areas too. But I want to thank all our panelists for being here. I also want to thank my team at the Community Relations Unit for supporting the panel in the background with the tech support, cameras, all that stuff. We couldn't have done it without you. I hope everyone has a great rest of the day, and hopefully you'll join us for another webinar or event with DCR. Thank you all, and have a great rest of the day.